Hello everyone, welcome to today's live. So today's live is about knowing the inheritance law of your country, and this is specifically for people in Great Britain like myself, parents in Great Britain like myself, and also in African countries such as Kenya and Uganda, but it can also apply to you in any other country. You just have to go and do your due diligence of basically researching the law in your country, okay? So the example that I'm going to be using in today's live is the law, the inheritance law of Kenya, okay? And it's very, very important that we know this law as parents so that we can write an informed will of what should happen to our assets and our children in case we pass away, and also what should happen to our finances, you know, from our assets when we pass away. All right, and who should not just manage it, but also for our children until a certain age, but also how it should be divided among our children if we've got more than one child. Okay, now in most countries, inheritance, when someone passes away, whether it's your husband or if you're a wife, if it's your husband and you have children, if they don't have a will written, the law can decide to give the inheritance to children of the person who's passed away, or the state, the government basically, the state, the country which they live in, will basically end up taking the assets and everything that the dead person left behind and keep it, and liquidating everything and keeping the money from the assets, okay? To avoid that, you have to make sure that you write a will, and the only way for you to write a very informed will is by you knowing exactly what the law says, who should get what, how much of it should they get, and when, okay? So in the case of Uganda, if you had a wife, okay, if we're talking about husbands now, if you had a wife or wives, they'll take 50% of your assets, okay? Your children, on the other hand, will only get 9%. And then the rest of your family members, like your brothers, your sisters, or your mom and dad, they will take 41%. That is in Uganda, okay? However, in Kenya, the percentage is not divided by percentage, but it's divided based on your relationship with the person who passed away, and also the evidence. So this relationship must be evidenced through certificates, okay? And this is where it's very, 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 very important that if you are married, whether you're a wife or a husband, that if you're married to someone, especially if you have assets, okay? If you have businesses like the one behind me, or you have a farm that is a business, or you know, or you use it just for family, or you have a property that you live in that you own, okay, or other types of businesses, or including real estate, and you have money also coming out of those businesses, that is very, very important that when you're married to the person, you actually get a marriage certificate. That's why it's not enough for you to just be traditionally married without a marriage certificate, okay? Because and then if you're married traditionally, you don't have a marriage certificate to prove your marriage, and then you end up having children, especially as a wife, okay? This happens more to women than men. Especially as a wife, the family members will contend with court and you end up losing everything. Your children would end up losing everything to the rest of the family members because you can't prove that you were legally married. Okay? Or in the case where they can prove with the children, like DNA and all of that, your children may end up getting something, but you end up with nothing, and yet you're the one who is left with your children, and you won't be able to look after them in the way that you would if you had assets. And also that's why it's very, very important as well as women that you know exactly where the finances of your family comes from, what you own, what is where, how to access it in case your husband dies. And also, husbands, it's important that you let your wives know, because some husbands don't let their wives know. They do everything because they're deemed as the provider of the home, so they don't inform their wives. They handle everything, like the bank details, everything, all the bills and everything, including the businesses of the family and everything. And in that situation where you pass away if you pass away as a husband before your wife, your family members will come and take claim of everything that you own because it's in your name, and leave your wife and children with nothing or the bare minimum, especially if you didn't write a will. Okay? And if you don't have marriage certificate to prove your marriage, you won't get anything, especially in Kenya, because if you can't prove it, if you weren't married, legally married, or you're not in a civil partnership, you wouldn't inherit anything. Ex-wives don't inherit anything. Ex-husbands don't inherit anything. Girlfriends don't inherit anything. Boyfriends don't inherit anything. Okay? So that is why it's very, 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 very important that if you're married, don't just play husband and wife. Make sure that it's documented, it's legally documented. Okay? And if you have young children, these are children below the age of 18 years old, especially if you are in the UK, it's important that you put your will in a trust so that assets will be released onto them slowly by age. Okay, so that they don't squander everything. And then it also allows you to put someone who will manage those assets for your children until they are of age where they can finally manage it themselves. Okay? So if you had children, you could say, okay, as they're young, this amount of money can be used to look after them, and then when they get to the age of 18, release another amount, this amount to them to cater to their needs. And then when they're 21 years of age, because that's when they normally go to university, or they end up going to college and doing other things for their lives as young adults, release this amount to them. And then when they reach 30, release this business to them. And then when they reach 35, release this final money and this final business to them, because you know that by that age you are assuming that they're able to look after the business and the finances without squandering it, and it will last them for the rest of their lives. Okay? And maybe if you even wanted their grandchildren, for example, their children, which would be your grandchildren, by that age they could begin to benefit from it. Okay? So, and inheritance is also a biblical thing, by the way. And the Bible says that a good man out of the goodness of his heart leaves an inheritance for his children and his children's children. So up to your great-grandchildren, basically. Okay? So it's a biblical thing. It's a biblical principle as well that we should put in place, especially those of us who are believers. Okay? So the example for Kenya, now Kenya's inheritance law was amended in 2021, okay, to make sure that the administration of succession matters in Kenya could be redefined to say who can inherit the deceased property, okay? So a person's ownership of property ceases upon his or her death. However, the property shall pass either to his heirs, which is his children and his family members, or the state, depending on the circumstances, okay? To make sure that the former, which is the one that is passed on to family members, children, and the living spouse and family members, is by making sure that the property owner drafts a will before his demise. So if you're the husband, make sure you have a will. If you're the wife, make sure you have a will, okay? Before you pass away. A will what is a will? You may ask. Okay, so this is what a will is. A will communicates a person's last wishes concerning his assets and dependents upon his death. So your will say what you want to happen to your assets, including your business, and also what happens to your children if you have young children. So some people will decide that, you know what, I want my children to be looked after by my relatives. On the other hand, some people who don't have family members, or they don't get along with their family members, they'll decide that the state will look after their children, depending on where in the world you live. That's why you see children end up being put in orphanages, end up being put in children's homes, children end up being put, especially young children, they end up being put in foster homes, and some end up being adopted, put out for adoption, okay? Right. The will outlines how the person's property will be distributed after his death, identifying who manages the property, including his financial interests until its final distribution. So if you had money from your businesses, If you had money in your personal bank account, your will show what should be done, should say what should be done with that money, and also who should manage it. Maybe you have a brother or you have a sister, you know, who you trust, or you have a father, a mother, your spouse, who should manage that until everything has been finally distributed equally between your family members and including your children. Okay? And then under his will, the deceased may wish the property to be held in trust for his dependents or distributed to his family. So you could have it in trust. So if you have young children, you could have your property held, your will held in trust. Holding your will in trust allows your children to have assets as they grow, released to them as they grow, so that nobody else can take it away, leaving them with nothing. Because that's what normally happens to children when you have greedy family members. They'll come and they'll take everything and leave your young children with nothing. They'll claim that they're going to be looking after your children, but they end up mistreating your children and just taking everything that belonged to you just because, and using your children as a way of getting your assets and your finances. Okay, so holding it in trust protects your assets and protects your children from being left with nothing. Okay. Or you could decide that you just want it to be distributed and that's it. The will outlines, okay, under his will, the deceased may, or distributed to family member, a group, or donated to charity. So if you had a charity that you supported, or if you had your own charity, you could also decide that your assets should be given to your charity. However, in the absence, so where there is no will, okay, in the absence of a will, so where basically the person did not write a will, okay, the deceased spouse and children, if you had any children, or next of kin, for example, your father or your mother, okay, will inherit the property. And this is where I'll say that it's very important that you don't just put strangers as your next of kin with hospital, doctors, or school. It's very, very important that you just don't put next of kin who are strangers, because they'll end up being given your assets when you pass away. Okay, so make sure that it's a family member who you deem worthy to have your assets. Okay. However, in some cases, a dependent may petition the court if he or she believes that the deceased under his will did not make reasonable provision for him or her. This is where people now begin to come to court and contend your will. Yeah, family members will come and contend your will. If you had older children, that's where they come and they contend and they say, well, my dad didn't get, or my mom didn't leave this amount. Maybe they get left with $1 million and a piece of land, and they wanted more. They'll go and have arguments in court, contend it, and say, well, it should have left me maybe $2 million and another portion of the shop, or a house, or a car, or, things like that. Or the animals, if you were into farming, yeah. So that is why it's very important that when you have children, whether they're young or older, you should divide everything equally between your children, so that they don't have the issue of contending in court. Okay, now this document is quite long, so I believe I've mentioned. Okay, so who are your the new law, yeah, who defines who dependents are. So number one, the dependent is a wife or wives, if you come from a polygamous family, former wife or wives, and the children of the deceased, whether or not maintained by the deceased immediately before his death. So even if you had children that you weren't looking after before you passed away, they are also entitled to your assets, okay, when you pass away. Number two, dependent also includes parents, step-parents, grandparents, grandchildren, stepchildren, children whom the deceased had taken into his family as his own, so adopted children or foster children. Okay. Number three, it includes, if the deceased was a woman, her husband, if he was being maintained by her prior to the date of her death. However, the Act has redefined the meaning of the word dependent to lock out former wife or wives of the deceased. So if you were divorced, basically, they don't, the people who you divorced, they don't have access to your assets, okay? The meaning of former wife or wives included divorced wives during the lifetime of the deceased. In this regard, a person cannot inherit the deceased's property. As a spouse, if such person divorced the deceased or such marriage came to an end by such other valid means during the deceased's lifetime, therefore, to be considered a spouse eligible to inherit the deceased property, evidence of marriage ought to be established that pre-existed immediately after the person's death. Such evidence can be by way of a valid marriage certificate. The amendment, however, acknowledged children seared by the deceased, regardless of whether or not they were maintained by the deceased immediately before his death. You see, when I told you family members will come, the spouses, that's when, especially the case of men, that's when, like, all the people you had children with, yeah, that's when they'll come and they'll be contending your will. Yeah, that's what happens. That's why it's very important to know the law. Okay, so what else? There is a condition precedent that a person claiming dependency other than the spouse or children of the deceased must establish. So you must show, if you're not the child or children or the spouse of the deceased person, you should have evidence. It requires that the person claiming dependency must prove that he or she was being maintained by the deceased immediately before his demise. Okay? The Act, however, allows persons not recognized as dependents under the amendment, such as those who were not married to the deceased, to fight for their rights if they feel aggrieved by the decision to lock them out of the deceased property. However, they were required to prove that the deceased was maintaining them within the last 2 years before the deceased's death. So even if you are claiming, you have to make sure that the person who has passed away, whether it's the wife or the husband, was looking after you 2 years before they passed away. Anything before that is classed as void in court according to the law. Okay, so that's where you see all this rift, all this strife coming along when somebody passes away, especially in the, I was going to say African setting, but even in Great Britain, people do that, especially among their African descent. They normally do that a lot. So it's very, very, very important that you know the law and you write your will accordingly, and also make sure that you live a life that wouldn't bring about so much contention over what you own when you pass away. And it's very, very important that you have children. The whole reason for these lives is that when you have children, that your children are catered for, because it's always children who end up, especially young children, who end up suffering when a parent passes away, or when parents pass away suddenly. Okay, so that is why it's important that you put your house in order, you put your will in place, you put your assets in place, and you know the law, and if you have older children, you also let them know. And also it lets them know what they can claim and what the government can't take away from them, the state can't take away from them, what family members can't take away from them. So that is the whole reason as to why I'm doing this live. Okay, so you can go and watch the rest and be informed how to write your will accordingly. And don't let before I finish this live, the last thing, don't let people write your will for you without you being informed. Don't let, because that's how people end up scamming people out of their inheritance. Don't let people write your will when you don't have understanding capacity. Like if you're out of your mind, if you're mentally ill, don't let people do that. If your spouse is out of their mind, don't let somebody else be the one to write their will for them. If you're married, if you're a spouse, make sure that you protect them. Make sure they have an advocate. And so yeah, that is basically what I would say. Don't let people, and even if you're in your right mind and you don't know the law, first find out what the law says before you write that will. Otherwise, you'll find that people will just end up scamming you out of your assets, and your children will be the one at loss. That is it, guys. I shall see you all in the next live. Bye.